Good evening, everybody. And we're going to start our tonight's webinar, Creating Equity and Representation in the Conservation Field. I am Emma Olmos, Alachua Conservation Trust Conservation Events Coordinator. I'm joined by Leanne Darcy, who is Alachua Conservation Trust Outreach Coordinator, and our speaker tonight, Dr. Nia Morales. I'm going to start by introducing Alachua Conservation Trust for those who don't know. ACT's mission is to protect the natural, scenic, historic, and recreational resources in and around North Central Florida. ACT protects land through acquisition, donation, and conservation easements in 16 counties. Tonight's presentation is part of ACT's Keep Florida Wild virtual series. If you would like to support future environmental education programming like tonight's talk, a donation can be made by texting Florida Wild to 44321. We appreciate your support. A recording of tonight's talk will also be available online following the event on ACT's YouTube channel. There will be a Q&A facilitated by me and Leanne after tonight's presentation this evening. You can submit your questions anytime during the presentation in the chat or in the Q&A option below at the bottom of your screens. Now to introduce Dr. Nia Morales. She is an assistant professor of human dimensions of wildlife in the University of Florida's Wildlife Ecology and Conservation Department, where her teaching and research generally focus on the role of social science in the conservation of fish and wildlife, as well as issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in conservation. Dr. Morales received her bachelor's and PhD from the University of Florida in the Wildlife Ecology and Conservation Department and has a master's in environmental education from Florida Atlantic University. Previous to her faculty role, Dr. Morales was the head of the Center for Conservation Social Science Research within the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission's Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, where she led a team of social scientists that provided support for the development and implementation of social science inquiry that helped FWC better understand the complex relationships between humans and their management of natural resources. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Nia, who will give her presentation.
Hi, thanks everyone for having me. Just give me a quick second so that I can get my screens in order and start to show these things here. Okay, is everybody seeing my screen? Hopefully. Okay. So again, thanks for having me. I'm here to talk a little bit about creating equity and representation in the conservation field. But I'd like to start with a story first. So this is me in probably 1985-ish. Here's me again on the left with my cousins and my sisters second to the right. I was born in Northampton, Massachusetts from a mixed race family. My mom is an immigrant from Central America. My dad's a mixed race guy. His father's African American. His mother is from Great Britain. They were both students at UMass when I came along. And over the years, I lived in mostly urban or suburban areas. My dad was a PhD student at the time that I was born and for about 10 years while I was growing up. And my mom had a variety of jobs and basically worked in the social work realm. So we didn't really do much outdoor stuff. We pretty much our recreation activities when we moved to South Florida were at the beach, but I never hunted, I never fished, I never camped until I was an adult. But what I did have was Saturday morning television. My exposure to nature mostly came from these programs. And as I look at this photo, I notice that it's mostly white men that inspired me to get into the conservation realm. I did actually go camping once in high school, but it was a fail. My family lasted about 8 hours. After night, I think some raccoons started to try and get into our tent. My mother freaked out and we went to a hotel room. But pretty much the way that I got into natural resources was by watching TV. The other thing that we did quite often was I was exposed to wildlife through built places like busch gardens or animal kingdom and zoos. So a lot of the times that I spent, getting to know about nature were pretty much spent in areas where animals were captive, and they were very built environments. Fast forward several years, as an adult, I have branched out and I've gotten to do all of those natural resource activities that I never did as a child. I've hunted. You can see me holding those things very daintily. I was not very good at it. I've fished, I've camped, I've backpacked, and I do kind of all those traditional things now that we consider natural resource recreation. I have 3 conservation-related degrees in wildlife ecology, environmental education, and again, in wildlife ecology. I'm a faculty member in wildlife ecology now, and all of this without having ever done ecology internships or traditional field experiences. So you might be asking, what does this have to do with you? Well, folks like me represent a very small number of conservation professionals, and we represent a growing faction in American society. So this goes beyond race and ethnicity and includes broader cultural shifts in how Americans relate or don't relate to nature. In order to be relevant in the future, you really can't wait for people like me to stumble across natural resources. You need to engage in a meaningful way. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about underrepresentation in the field and what organizations like ACT and others can do about it. So here's just another slide. For the purposes of this talk, I'm referring to underrepresentation with regard to race and ethnicity, and a lesser extent gender. But when we talk about representation, this also has to do with LGBTQ issues and accessibility and disability. So the US population has been changing over time. In around 2000, minorities made up about 25% of the population, and that's grown. And by 2050, it's expected that minorities will be a majority in the United States population. However, when we look at natural resource career fields, we don't see that ethnic and racial minorities match their rate in general population. So the stats at the bottom here, natural resource degree holders as of 2019. This is basically the top 5 institutions with the most degrees awarded in conservation natural resources. So there you can see that 70% of people in natural resource careers are white, 9.8% Hispanic, about 2.5% Black, and 3.75% Asian. And many organizations tout increases in females as a diversity win. So we can see now that as of 2019, almost half of the degree earners and folks in the career fields are women, but there's still a lack of racial and ethnic diversity in most places. This figure is getting a little bit old. It's from Dorset Taylor in 2014, but it's still very representative. It's not just that minorities are underrepresented in natural resource careers, but they're also underrepresented at various levels in different ways. So if you look at NGOs, about 20% of interns are people of color, but as you go up the line to leadership and board slots, the number decreases a lot. So by the time you get to board positions, only about 4% of people in NGO boards are people of color. Same thing when you look at government agencies and foundations. As you go up the ladder, there are fewer and fewer racial and ethnic minorities. If we sort of switch gears here and talk a little bit about outdoor recreation, you still see similar trends where white people outnumber, well, white people serve a larger percentage of folks engaging in these traditional outdoor recreation activities. You also see a difference in the type of activities. If you look at racial and ethnic differences, there tends to be lower participation among African Americans and Hispanic and Latinos in what would be traditionally wildland leisure, lower participation in hunting, fishing, and other consumptive activities. Non-Hispanic white folks are more likely to engage in individual activities, so things like hiking or hunting, whereas Hispanics and African Americans are more likely to engage in social activities where there are larger groups in the same area doing the same activities, more social activities among these different groups. When we think about barriers, the barriers to career and recreation can be similar, and they're interrelated because exposure to early types of outdoor recreation is often a precursor to career interests. Some of these barriers can be structural, and that could be financial, so not having money to engage in an activity or to go up through higher education. Lack of access, it could be lack of access to green spaces, quality education, opportunities for advancement. There are social barriers, lack of mentors or peers that do that activity or in your major or career path, interests of individuals not being taken seriously, and then isolation when you're doing the activity or when you're in the workplace. If you're the only woman or the only Hispanic person or the only LGBTQ person. Safety is also a common issue. So physical altercations with public or law enforcement. There's been a lot of very publicly documented cases of this, like the murder in New York. This has been something that has gone on for a long time. It's only just now that a lot more people have cell phones on them, so these videos get captured. And then the historical legacy of brutality in natural spaces. To many cultures and many groups, the outdoors is not a safe place to be, and it hasn't been historically. So trying to encourage participation, you may run into the barrier that historically people were brutalized in these areas, and so there might be a legacy effect to that. There's also cultural differences in how people value nature. Even the concept of wilderness is a very European concept. So other cultures don't share the same core values about what the relationship between humans and nature actually is. And also there's a lack of the dominant culture embracing these different ways of interacting with nature. I do hear often that people say, why aren't there more people of color in ... But in my opinion, it should be, how can we create spaces and opportunities for everyone? So I'm going to talk a little bit about ways that organizations are and can address some of these barriers. And before I do this, I want to briefly start out with a few terms. So DEI has come to the forefront of a lot of organizations in the recent past, but it's important to kind of be on the same playing field or on the same level when we talk about these terms. So diversity is the presence of differences that can include race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, ... Equity is promoting justice, impartiality, and fairness within procedures and processes. And then inclusion is a degree to which diverse individuals are able to participate fully in the decision-making process. And as related to the type of work that I do at UF, most of the stuff that I do research on has to do with equity and inclusion, and I have interest in working with diverse stakeholders to improve conservation decision-making. So when we think about improving DEI efforts, in the context of a talk like this, I would break it up into two realms. I would break it up into organizational, so these are the things that the organization itself could be doing, and outreach. Many organizations have an outreach arm, so a lot of folks here, I saw some names from my City of Gainesville days, so I know there's a few environmental educators here in the seminar or webinar. So there are many resources for human resource type folks, but I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation talking more about the outreach side. And I will say as well, I'm not attaching a list of citations or anything at the end of this, but if you're interested in me forwarding some resources to you, I have plenty that I've saved, and I'm more than happy to send an email, so just check in with me afterwards during the Q&A, and I can definitely send you some resources. So the first thing I'd like to say is that DEI in general is a moral imperative. You can't just sprinkle a few diverse candidates in, throw in some language about inclusion, and have a couple of trainings about anti-bias and expect to magically have a diverse and inclusive place to work. You really have to build these things into the fabric of your organization and the organization's processes and values. So if you're starting to think about putting together a diversity plan, it's really important to critique the underlying reasons that you want to do this. Is it because you realize that your staff is not very diverse, or is it because you realize the people that you're reaching out to are not very diverse? And are you doing this because of the optics, or because you actually care as an organization or an individual to incorporate more diverse life experiences into the way you do your business? So DEI is definitely a way of thinking. It's not just a checkbox. You know, having an African American, 2 Hispanic people, and 1 Asian person on your staff isn't really a check, we've done diversity. It's really about understanding that having people with different backgrounds and different perspectives give you better answers and better solutions to the types of issues that your organization will have to deal with. And it creates more relevancy for your organizations, because communities are changing around us. And if we're still reaching out to just a core group of people, you know, that support starts to dwindle over time, and you're just not relevant to these changing communities. And then engaging with the community also, just like engaging with these HR issues, has to be purposeful. Again, it's not about checking a box and making sure that you've reached out to you know, folks on the east side of town who tend to be, you know, the African American side of town. That's not really DEI. That's just a checkbox. So creating inclusive and equitable programs, it's really about creating relevant programming. These outreach and educational activities should be place-based. And when I say place-based, I mean embedded in the immediate area. So for example, if you are doing a stream bed educational outreach activity, you should incorporate the history of that area so that people are getting in touch with their own communities. Who's lived in this community over time? How has this stream affected communities? What are the types of species that live there that are culturally or historically relevant to these communities around there? Programming should also be culturally relevant, and this means you have to take steps to understand what types of dominant communities are around and what their historical perspectives are. So instead of having just the same historical lens that you may have for one type of presentation, it's really important to really, I would say, know your audience in this case by doing a little bit of homework about who is in this area and what those cultures might, what cultural perspectives might exist in that area, so that you can reflect those in the programming. I think also when we get into education and outreach with a lens of equity and inclusion, we should also be talking about benefits to local communities. I think that in sort of, people understand the value of outdoor recreation and being outside. They understand that there are health benefits to it. But I think that sometimes those are touted as the reason you should get outside, when there are opportunities for organizations to also have community benefits, such as opportunities for community cleanups, potential job opportunities, things that can actually affect communities in different ways beyond just it's good or healthy to be outside. And also inviting different ways of knowing or types of engagement. So this could include broadening the types of programming. Instead of doing a hike that might be difficult for folks who are disabled or might pose access issues, you can go into local communities and do some kind of like a trunk program where you bring resources to them. So it's really just talking about being more creative with the resources that you have and how you garner interest in the environment in creative ways. And another really huge one is ensuring safety in field for interns and participants. Like I said before, there's a lot of negative baggage tied into natural resources and outdoor recreation due to very valid safety concerns. Alachua County is, the city of Gainesville is a fairly safe place to be for most people. Some people will have more difficulty in those more rural areas where if you're a Black woman or a Black man working for the city of Gainesville and you're out there in some of those rural areas, that can pose a very legitimate safety threat. So understanding that other people might have difficulties when it comes to safety is really important, that you're proactive in building that in whenever you have programs, either for those participants or if you have people from minoritized backgrounds who are working for you and making those considerations when they go out in the public to do programs. So I mentioned before that not only are there differences in rates of participation among different racial and ethnic groups, but there's different preferences, and those, a lot of research has pointed to some cultural differences and socialization differences in how people recreate. So this should be reflected in the types of programs that are offered. Hispanic and Latinos tend to visit natural areas in larger family-oriented groups. I know from experience that my family, when we get together, we're always rolling at least 10 deep. So you better have a big picnic table for us because we're bringing everybody. Tends to be that non-Hispanic whites and some African-American groups, depending on regions, and some Asian groups prefer more solitary visits and tend to only bring close friends or family. So understanding that there are some variability culturally in how people choose to recreate and who they choose to bring to share those situations with is really important when you're designing and considering the types of facilities. And there's also differences in the type of time spent in destinations. It's very common for Hispanic and Latino groups to spend a whole day sitting in one area together, whereas other types of groups might be more inclined to move around a lot more. And there's different preferences for the type of management of outdoor recreation sites. So again, there's research suggesting that Hispanics and Latinos favor well-developed parks and recreation sites that include picnic areas, fire rings, parking spaces, play areas, so the more built environment, whereas other racial and ethnic groups tend to have a more prefer a more wilderness experience. So all of these are just considerations that should go into your mind when you're thinking about types of programming, location, and potentially facilities in natural areas. And it's also important to note that about a quarter of adults in the US have some type of disability. And so this can pose a problem for, well, not a problem, issues to overcome in designing facilities and also in coming up with ways to engage with folks with limited abilities. There are ADA-specific guidelines for access to recreational areas, but above that, oftentimes when we're giving outdoor education and outreach events, it can be a challenge to figure out how to make sure that these events are accessible to a diverse group of people, especially when it includes differences in disabilities and access. So what are some tips for engaging with communities and things to think about? Really showing that you care about providing recreational opportunities to all. Like I said, DEI is not a checkbox. An organization shows that they're really valuing DEI when they show that they actually care by informing the way that they make decisions about their products and their outreach. Know your constituents. So know your audience. Learn about their needs, what types of communities you're in. Learn about their motivations and those possible constraints so you can find ways around them. Think creatively about how to alleviate those constraints and to encourage participation. And so this is a social science plug. So this is where you might engage with a social scientist who is adept at facilitating meetings or doing surveys, open house opportunities, that kind of thing, so that you can get that data. Be open to new activities and new offerings. So if you have a traditional suite of educational and outreach programming, but it's not really attracting the types of folks that you're trying to bring in, you may have to freshen those up a bit. And also be mindful of who's employed in your agency or organization and who has decision-making powers. And then developing targeted marketing campaigns. So making sure that not only have you learned about your audience and the people that you want to attract, but also making sure that you are getting your message to the right circles. Are you attending community social events so that they can see your face and see you as a trusted agency or organization? Are you, if you're trying to reach immigrant populations, say if you're in an urban area, do you have your materials in multiple languages? If you're trying to reach Hispanic populations, do you have your information in Spanish? And then again, when we're engaging with folks with disabilities, designing accessible facilities, there's a concept called universal design, which has, I think, 7 principles on how to design things so that anybody, regardless of their physical ability, can figure out how, best way to open a door, how to reach different facilities, that sort of thing. Adaptive equipment, and then making sure to check biases and stereotypes as you're doing your programming so that you're not limiting how you think, you're not making assumptions about somebody's ability or disability. And then lastly, I wanted to leave you all with some tips for practical allyship. So as evidenced by joining a seminar like this, educating yourself is very important, and examining your own or your organization's blind spots. We all have biases. It's innate to how humans behave, but acknowledging where they are and learning to work on them is really important. Advocating for others. So if you are in a privileged position, then, in order to really embody those DEI kind of principles, it's important to speak for others when they may not have the power to do so themselves. And create spaces for others. Creating spaces and moving out of the way are interrelated. So creating spaces for others means that you may have a situation where there's a program or an event or a discussion where it's just not for you, it's for someone else. And in that situation, leave it for them. That's for them to work out. That's for them to have that time. That's for them to be centered and for you to take a step back. Holding the powerful accountable. That's a very difficult one. I'm a very non-confrontational person, so I struggle with this one too, but it's really important to chip away at that. If anybody, if those systems that are in place that create these barriers and perpetuate these barriers are never questioned, they'll stay in place. And so it's really in all of our best interest to hold the powerful accountable wherever we can. And lastly, don't expect praise or gratitude. I think this is also a very important one because oftentimes, on social media, I think especially, we make these shows of support, but when, the rubber really hits the road, are you doing these things so that people think that you are woke or they think that you are, trying to be an ally? Or are you really doing these things because you truly believe that we need to center the narrative around other groups? We need to break down these barriers. So it's not for everybody to get a gold star. It's so that we can all support each other. So with that, I will wrap up and I'm happy to take questions. I see there was some stuff in the chat, which I couldn't see because of my windows, but I guess we can address that now. So thank you, everybody.
Hi, Mia. Thank you for presenting, and equity and representation is an extremely important issue for me personally. So this webinar has been a great addition to our series. Before we go into the Q&A portion of tonight's webinar and get to all these questions, I want to take a moment to highlight some of the ways that ACT is working to break down these barriers to access that you were discussing. As a land trust, we're working with properties and our community to foster stewardship in North Central Florida. And we do this partly through internship programs where we get the opportunity, where we get students to have the opportunity to get hands-on experience with land management, advocacy, and outreach as it relates to our work. And within that internship program, we have the Women in the Woods program, which focuses on getting women into our land management internships and facilitating growth in both their skills and confidence, with a still mostly male-dominated part of the conservation field being land management. Another initiative is ACT's Florida Wild for All Scholarship. This scholarship is for students of color that are high school seniors and students who are in a 2 or 4 year college program. Also students who are in a non-college affiliated natural resource management program, so like AmeriCorps. This scholarship aims to amplify young voices of color in our community that are passionate about the environment. Our first round was this past year in 2021, and we awarded 4 scholarships and 3 honorable mentions to wonderful and deserving students, and we're gearing up for our next round in 2022. To engage our younger students, we have the CREEK program, and I saw Randy Camion is on tonight, and so she helps run the CREEK program, which takes 4th graders to from underserved schools in the East Side out to our preserve at Little Orange Creek Nature Park, where they learn the basics of wetland and wildlife ecology. ACT is also working to get an ADA accessible trail on Serranola Preserve, and we continue to work towards making our preserves more accessible to people with disabilities. And then I also have to mention and plug our Pride at Prairie Creek event that will be happening on Sunday, October 24th from 1 to 4 at Prairie Creek Lodge. It'll be a great day to spend some time outdoors and celebrate with the LGBTQIA plus community. And then lastly, before we start answering these questions, I want to mention that as ACT works to break down these barriers to access and be more inclusive as an organization, we are always looking for feedback from our community. During this process, if anybody from the webinar tonight or knows anybody who has feedback or comments on our organization's accessibility, we have a Google form where you can provide feedback. It'll be posted in the chat, and it also can be found linked in our bio in our Instagram, which is at Alachua Conservation Trust. And with that being said, I'm going to pass it on to Leanne Darcy, who is our ACT's outreach coordinator. She'll be helping facilitate the Q&A with me. Don't hesitate to keep asking questions as we keep going and as they come up. Leanne, take it away.
Hi guys, thank you Emma and thank you Nia for your wonderful presentation. And with that being said, let's jump right into Q&A. The first question we have here is from Lucinda Merritt. It's, Dr. Morales, do you know if any research has been done by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and or the Florida Park Service about how minority populations prefer to use our state parks that are centered around freshwater springs?
I don't know of anything specifically. Some of the work that I mentioned in the webinar, I can send to you if you shoot me your email address. That's probably going to be more centered around general leisure outdoor recreation as opposed to freshwater springs in specific. But I would imagine that some of those same generalizations might still hold.
Thank you. Next from our Q&A, we have, how do we do a better job at recruiting for environmental jobs?
I think that's always the question of the day. I think for that one is tough. It's a bit like a catch-22, especially when it comes to recruiting for diversity. Getting connected to universities, I think, is a really good way of broadening your reach, especially if you can get in contact with minority serving institutions. For example, FAMU up in Tallahassee, they, I think, have a wildlife program, if I'm thinking of the right university. You can get the message out to those sorts of places. The other thing I will give a little shout out to, there's an organization through Wildlife Ecology that's called Natural Resources Diversity Initiative. So Kiara Clancy is their president, and I can put her, well, actually, you reach out to me because I don't want to put her email out on blast, but she does a lot of outreach to schools and brings graduate students, and there's a lot of graduate students of color and undergrads who are part of this group, and one of their goals is to do science outreach to the community. So if you're interested in potentially having a partnership with them, I'm sure that Kira would be very open to it. And most of the folks in Nerdy are students of color.
That was very well put. Our next chat question is from Randy. It says, our environmental education program targets schools with predominantly minority youth. We love to have representation among our environmental educators that reflect the population we serve. Any suggestions for broad outreach to find environmental educators from diverse backgrounds?
So definitely that's the plug for Nerdy. I think that they'd be a great group to reach out to. I'm not entirely sure if there is, so the NAAE does a lot, National Association of Environmental Education. They have a very robust diversity plan. And they may have as part of their networking or contact list through their DEI initiative, they probably have names of environmental educators. And I'm not sure if that's the same case with National Association of Interpreters or Interpretation, if they have that kind of list, but it would be worthwhile to check out those.
Awesome. This next question is from the chat, and it is, how can we best figure out what the community wants in terms of activities that they're interested in? And it kind of lists some options, but I'll let you take it away from there.
All of the above. Yeah, so determining what kind of methods to understand your community, it depends on the community, what type of method you actually choose to use. A lot of times now, email surveys tend to have very low response, and that's also not necessarily the best way, especially if you're targeting a community that might be low income or rural, that might not have great internet access. But putting together a short survey that introduces your organization and who you are, and brief questions about how you can best serve them, you can put those things in churches, community centers. It's also really helpful to do outreach where you go to a community center and just introduce yourself, because like that brings a little bit of trust into things too, so that they don't feel like you're just swooping in to try and get information about them. It really is about building relationships.
And one just came in that kind of ties into that, which is, do you think that meeting and talking with elementary school teachers of underrepresented students could help provide the appropriate cultural context design outreach programs?
Yeah, I do. I do think that there's a challenge there with when we reach out to the public schools, because they have a lot to do and not a lot of resources to get things done. But I think that it can. The other part that I meant about cultural context, and I didn't really explain very much, is also that when we do programs, we acknowledge some of the problematic parts of our historical relationships to the environment and some of the issues with communities of color and how we have treated them. So when I say cultural context, I don't just mean understanding how they want to engage, but I also mean sort of bringing the olive branch and saying, hey, this community, this environmental community has not always treated these communities right, but we're trying to turn over a new leaf here, and we want to partner with you and make sure that we have programming that serves your youth in your community.
Thank you for that answer. Our next chat question is from Lucinda, and it says, we have a new website for the Ichthyophony Alliance, and we really need minority voices, but have had no luck finding people to provide those voices. Are there any tips on how to reach out in an authentic way so we won't be perceived as just wanting to check off a box? I really want these stories about Ichthyophony and the Ichthyophony history, which I suspect is not squeaky clean.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I'm going to default to reaching out to local community centers. I'm sure that there are some folks if you go to areas of town that are primarily African American, or whatever the minority population that you're interested in, I'm sure in the libraries, in the community centers, and in the churches, there are some folks there that have some stories and have some lived experiences that they'd be willing to share. Honestly, this is going to be probably the third time that I've said this. It's really all about building the relationships. We have had very troubled relationships with communities of color in the past, and now is the time to acknowledge that and make sure that you're saying that you want to center their voices because their voices have not previously been heard. So I don't know who those people are specifically. It is a rural community out there, but I'm pretty sure that if you can get connected to the right people, that there are people who are willing to share those stories.
Thank you so much. I kind of answered another one of those questions already, so I'm going to move on to another question, which is, because so many different people are experiencing nature and green spaces uniquely, and we have all these different communities that are engaging with nature from different cultural contexts and such, how can we best engage all groups in a way that is bringing communities together and not in a way that is kind of avoiding having different activities that feel like they're centered or targeted towards different community groups?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I definitely don't mean to say that each activity or each outreach program needs to be specifically focused. But I think what I'm saying is that there just has to be a broader recognition that when you do a program, there's a lot behind that. Going in to do a program and you don't know if the students have ever been to that natural area. You don't know if the students or participants have ever had positive, negative, or neutral relationships to those things. It's really more about understanding those audiences better, not necessarily that you should tailor each outreach program to a Hispanic audience or an African-American audience, but just kind of be a little bit more open, receptive of perhaps their different understanding about a particular topic. And I definitely do think that there are programs that are broad enough that everybody would enjoy, participating in them.
Thank you. We have another question that is, what is a common misconception regarding equity and conservation in the conservation field that you would like to shed light on and clear up?
A common misconception. I think I do get the checkbox thing a lot. And I believe that people are willing to embrace DEI when it's convenient to them. And that is I'd say that's probably the most common misconception. They don't realize that this is not just something you do right now because it's popular and, Black Lives Matter is on social media all over the place. It's something you do because it's long overdue. And DEI is not necessarily just having voices at the table so that you can have, the colors of Benetton represented, but it's so that you can really engage with the differences. I really hate the term being colorblind, because if you're colorblind, you're not recognizing that people are different. And I think in those differences is where we should share those stories and not just sort of assimilate into one blob. That wasn't very articulate, but that's kind of the gist.
I totally get what you're saying, though. We have one here that is regarding land and the natural areas. What is the best way to acknowledge those histories in a way that is representative and respectful, especially when some of those histories might be painful for some? So I think you've kind of answered it in terms of going out to community groups, but when those histories that when we want to balance erasure with also not traumatizing different groups from some of these lands. North Central Florida is just not a very nice place for a lot of people in the past. How do you keep that balance while you're educating some, but not traumatizing other groups?
Yeah, honestly, I think the acknowledgement itself is powerful. You don't have to hash up the details unless it's relevant to the program, but simply acknowledging. So there's a trend now where a lot of folks who conduct, conferences and meetings, although we're doing everything virtually again now, where they have a land acknowledgement, where they acknowledge the indigenous tribes that have lived and currently live in spaces. That acknowledgement, I think, is very powerful because it says, I recognize that I am on a place that has value and meaning and a negative history caused by the dominant group. We don't have to go into that trauma necessarily, but I think that the first step is saying that the past isn't rosy, and we understand that. and now we're moving forward. And I think, you know, that in itself is worth a lot.
Thank you. I think that's a great answer. And I think it definitely gets to like the whole meat of it all, which is that this is not about the dominant group anymore. This is about bringing in the voices of those who have been underrepresented for so long. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A and no more in the chat. I'll wait just a little bit longer, see if anything else pops up. And while I do that, I'm just going to plug our next webinar, which is going to be next month. It is going to be on Tuesday, September 28th. For anybody who would like to join, we'll also have information going up on that on our website in the coming weeks. Thank you so much, Nia, for presenting again and speaking on this topic. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and everybody have a great night.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I will say real quick before everybody signs off, I read this book that was really interesting called Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. And she used the metaphor about an old house. And she said that we weren't there when the house was built, but the house is crumbling and we're the ones who need to address it. So I'll leave everybody with that.
So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great evening.